Welcome to the Testing 123 podcast. As always, I'm Brett here with Lester. Lester, before we dive into our topic today, little old Earth versus young Earth theory, battle, points going across, flying. Question for you. I recently saw that the Olympics that were supposed to happen this summer are now happening. Well, supposed to happen last summer are now happening this summer. But they're still calling them the 2020 Olympics.
Saw that like so
Thoughts?
part of me is like, ugh, why don't just call them the 2021? Everybody knows it's fine. It's not like we're pretending here. But then
Like, are they trying to? They tried to like date it so like when 50 years people look back, like they didn't know that we had to do them a year late. Like,
yeah.
Oh no, those must have happened in 2020.
So yeah, it was the 20. I mean, it was 2021, but it was 2020. But like, it was 20. Like, but then the other part of me, maybe the cheaper part of me, the financially responsible part of me was like, oh, but then they save so much money on rebranding. They don't have to pay another guy to.
That's so true. All those signs that say 2020 Olympics, that is actually such a good point. Didn't even think of it.
Oh,
that's so smart.
The advertising.
Yeah.
You don't have to redesign a logo. All this. That's millions of dollars right
Guaranteed
there.
That's the reason. You got to follow the money and all these issues. And that is, wow, what a point by Lester calling it. Okay, I'll finish it with, are you a Summer Olympics guy or a Winter Olympics guy?
Oh, winter all day. Winter Olympics. That's the jam.
Explain.
Yeah, I mean, I love hockey. Who doesn't love hockey? And, you know, I love snowboarding, and that's just, the winter speaks to me. Also, Canada dominates at winter. We're pretty terrible at summer. So I just like to watch a winter.
That's true. I just say winter because for summer, there's way too many events, and I just don't know what to follow. But I am pumped golf is back part of the Olympics, because it should have always been. Because if you're going to tell me 8 different things swimming are all different sports, but golf isn't there, disrespect.
Come on. And the other thing is summer. I mean, there's so many sports that I watch once every 4 years. Like, are you seriously watching rowing? Like, come on, dude. Who?
I mean, no. I'm only watching it if a Canadian's like competing for the gold.
Yeah, exactly.
But
like, so
you know what I do love? I don't follow any of these sports ever. Like, I follow football, baseball, basketball, hockey, like, and golf. Those where all my sport goes to. And I mean, F1 I actually follow quite a bit as well. But I don't follow any of these weird, like, I'm not going to call them weird sports, but like all these Olympic sports. But when the moment is there and they're competing, you're like, oh yeah, you're so into it. And I love it because there's always a guy in the room who just is like random stats guy who just like knows, like, I don't know if he's watched it for like 5 years. Has he seen someone do this? He goes, oh, yeah, this is like world number one, been crushing it for 3 years. Like absolutely should win this event. Like, nowhere. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no. Oh, he's coming in with a knee injury. Like, oh, he picked that up at the Open last week.
Yeah, it's just like you've been watching shot put for the last 4 years. Like, these things, but it's still somehow like you still get captivated and you still watch. Like for some reason you feel like there's stakes when there's like you like never know these people, and a week after the events you're just not even gonna remember. All right, that's enough bashing of the Olympics. We're gonna jump into our podcast, guys. It's a pretty good one. Just a fun. Honestly, I had fun filming it because it was just like it's not a super major issue that I think we need to stress about in our lives. But yeah, we will go through that and then we'll see you next week. Welcome to the Testing 123 podcast. As always, I'm Brett, joined by Lester. Today we just got a good fight for you, just a good battle. Get in there, throw some hooks, some jabs. We're talking about old Earth versus young Earth from a Christian perspective. I'm just going to preference this whole talk by this isn't a primary or even secondary issue in the Bible. We are not saying if you believe one or the other, then like you're not a Christian or you're wrong or you're right. There's a lot of smart people on both sides that have done a lot more study than me and Lester. and have come to conclusions that we disagree with or agree with. So I think this is just fun. I know that Lester's been talking about this with a bunch of people. I have friends who've been talking about this. It's honestly, it's just kind of a fun thing to talk through, see what you believe, and see a different opinion. I wouldn't listen to this and be like, oh, I'm so wrong, or these guys are idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. If you disagree with us, great. Like just have a found like sound opinion, and then you're good. Like there's not. For me, I've never really cared about this issue from my background. I'll let Lester speak to his, but like I don't think it matters either way, like for salvation, but I do think it's something we should talk about.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's important to talk about so that we understand what we believe, and you have an answer for people who are asking you questions. And actually, for myself, it was actually a bit of an important issue as I came to faith. It was something for me to consider and have an answer for. It was something that I really wanted to understand for myself. Now, just because it was important for me doesn't mean it has to be important for you. Everybody comes to faith a different way. So I totally understand that, you know, it's not going to be important for everybody. And honestly, as Brett was saying, it's a tertiary issue, right? I mean, we have primary issues like, is Jesus God? There's the Trinity. Jesus died on the cross for my sins and rose again 3 days later. Those are very, very important issues. If we disagree on those, we have a big problem.
Yeah,
There are
I mean
secondary issues. Yeah.
we
There's
we can't be arguing did Jesus rise from the dead and both say that we're Christians arguing the opposite sides of that.
exactly. Yeah. And then there's secondary issues like, who gets to take communion? Who gets to get baptized? How do we baptize people? How often do we baptize people? How often do we take communion? Those kinds of things, very secondary issues. They're important. They're very important, but, kind of secondary. And then there's this third class of issues like, how old is the earth? How long did God take to create the universe? Very, very tertiary. Very, very kind of low on the priority of salvation and your faith journey. These are less important questions, but thinking about them does help us understand our faith better, and it does help us understand the Bible better. It does affect the way that we read the Bible, just not in a primary or secondary way.
Yeah, and I
So,
think I think we could be helpful here by understanding like if you're going to deal with your non-Christian friends and other people, maybe this is something like Lester said that they struggle with. They're like, well, I can't believe the Bible because they think the earth was created in 6 days or they think the earth was created in 6 billion years, like whatever that is. So it's good to know about.
yeah,
And it's also good to know about because as you like walk with God and challenge your faith, you have to either like choose to trust the word of God or like come to your own propositions. The Bible isn't always just like do this, do that. There's a lot of gray area, and this is an area where some people would say it's very black and white. Some people would say it's gray, depending on your point of view. But it's just something, and honestly, I think it's fun. I think it's fun to go through. I think it's fun debate to have. I don't think we're going to leave here too invested in one side. And to be honest, I think me and Lester, unfortunately, on this issue, don't clash as much as it would help for the podcast sake. But we do kind of agree on the same style. But we won't let you into that. We'll just jump into it because we want you guys to just have a good podcast, but also just to get something from it. And also, this is our second one remote, so hopefully it's better than our first one remote.
we'll see. We'll
We'll
see.
see. All right, Lester, why don't we jump in and let's just do an overview of what an old Earth Christian would think and what a young Earth Christian would think. You take which one you want. I'll do the other.
Sure. Yeah. So why don't I start with an old Earth creationist? So we're coming at this debate just assuming creation, right? So we're not going to get too much into the ideas of intelligent design, but I'm just going to lay this out there briefly so that we understand the terms that we're getting at. So intelligent design refers to like the belief that the universe was created by a being, a creator, and we see that because of the way that the earth is designed and ordered and how everything fits together. So that's an important part of our assumptions or beliefs today as we're talking about old earth creation and young earth creation. We're not just saying that all these things, even if we're talking about old earth, that they came from nothing. We're talking about how they came from God. We're really talking about how God made the earth. So, as an old Earth creationist, um, or an old Earth creationist would say that there are two types of revelation, and this is true of young Earth creationists as well. There are two types of revelations, the ways that God reveals himself to us. First, there's special revelation, and that's most important, and that has to do with the Bible, right? So God reveals himself to us through Scripture, and he shows us who he is by how he acts throughout history. So that's special revelation. And then there's also natural revelation, where God shows us who he is with his creation. All around us, we see God's handiwork. And we see how great he is by seeing his universe. And so, an old earth creationist would say that understanding the world of God also leads to understanding the word of God. So what I'm saying there is that uh, the more you understand the world around you, the better understanding you have of God's creation, the better understanding you have of God. So that's a paraphrase of Galileo. Um, he's a lot smarter than I am, but essentially that's his idea that the better we understand um, science, then the better it will be for us. And so it's not that the Bible has errors, right? When it comes to science, it's simply that science reveals to us our interpretation errors. So we've been reading it wrong as opposed to science is wrong, um, or the Bible is wrong, if that makes sense. So an older creationist would say that, well, because scientists have identified that the Earth is billions, or sorry, not the Earth, but the universe is billions of years old, then that means that when God created the Earth and the world, the universe, that it must have been billions of years old, and the Big Bang is the methodology in which God used to create the Earth. And they cite things like the Earth. The crust in the earth and how it was formed a certain way, and also how the universe is expanding and all those types of things, to say that, look, the universe is X number of years old. Now, how they square that with something like Genesis 1 is they say, well, yom, that the word yom in Hebrew is the word day. So we see that all over
I'm gonna
Genesis
cut you
1, the
off,
narrative.
Lester,
Yeah, go
because
ahead.
we're gonna battle over the word yom
Go ahead.
because
Yeah.
both sides that's like that's like a really crucial part to
Yeah.
reading the first like start of Genesis is a lot of it just comes down to that one word, sorry.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there and then I'm gonna go as quick as I can on Young Earth because it's just super easy to explain. With everything that Lester let in on how we're viewing this, like from God's view, obviously we're none of this conversation will be that like evolution happened by itself. Like this is all God creation, just two different views of how he did it. Young Earth is a simply literal translation. Wow, that was rough. Literal translation of Genesis. One
Mhm.
day, next day, next day, next day, next day. Does it in 6 days, rests on the seventh. It's as simple as that. It's first day, second day, third day, and it's our human days, like our 24-hour periods. That's the simplest way I could explain it. I mean, there's a lot of other things that go into there because, like, as Lester mentioned, like, oh, what about like light is a big argument on both sides. Like, oh, we see stars, lights from the other side of the galaxy, billions. We can know that they're billions of miles away, which means it takes billions of years, stuff like that. We can get into that and break it down, but for an overview, a Christian young Earth is just going to say, no, I'm going to take God's word literally
Mhm.
in the start of Genesis, and this is how He did it, and that's why we model our week, and that's how we should view our world. And then honestly, there's a lot of explanation. They have explanations for like, oh, this is how that phenomenon occurs, or
Mhm.
this is why like certain things seem that they're really old, but maybe there's an explanation for that. Like, so we'll get into that, but yeah, like pretty simple debate. Old Earth, God worked through the Big Bang, billions of years. Young Earth, 6 days.
Yeah. Essentially, that's what it is, and either of these interpretations, I will say, are acceptable. And actually, even amongst the Springvale staff, we have people that believe one and then others that believe the other. Um, so this is definitely not something to be divisive over. And it's not something to really, really excoriate somebody about like their
Yeah,
interpretation of
like
the
I hope
Bible
no one's
over.
taking this and goes, well, you know what? Everyone who's a young Earth or everyone who's an old Earth theory is an idiot, and I'm not
Yeah,
even going to
no,
talk to them.
they're
Like,
they're not Christians. They're just not.
yeah, maybe don't take it that far. Like
Yeah,
we've done a pretty good job of saying this isn't a huge issue,
yeah,
and you shouldn't be using this as a sword against other brothers and sisters in the faith.
yeah.
You know, like
So
there's
yeah. So you want to get into this day?
yeah, we'll get into Yom. Yom is the key. In all my research, Yom, Yom, Yom. Yom means day in Hebrew,
Yes.
and that's kind of where the start of this. How do we translate the Bible? Because we're both young and old Earth are coming from the view of obviously the Bible's correct. It's how we view and how do we interpret that,
Yeah.
right? And so Genesis 1 kind of hinges on the word Yom. Do you want to break it down further? Because you started and I cut you off, so I
Yeah.
feel bad.
Okay. So here we go. So Yom is an incredibly important word.
Yikes, I wasn't even saying it right.
Yeah. Yom. It's okay. You're not the one that had to suffer through 2 years of Hebrew.
That's
So
true, but I could have figured it out. Sorry.
anyway, Yom is an incredibly important word in Genesis 1, in the narrative of Genesis 1. Now, what I'll essentially do is explain the old earth thinking, and then, I don't know, Brett, you can touch on the young earth thinking with Yom. But essentially, with the old earth thinking, uh, there are two ways that people come at the idea. So some old earth creationists will still say Yom was 24 hours, it's just 24 hours. Where they fit the trillions or billions of years is they'll fit it in verses 1 and 2. So that word Yom does not occur in verses 1 and 2. It says, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. They'll say right there in those two verses, billions of years transpired. The universe he created right there in verses 1 and 2, and billions of years transpired in that time. And then verse 3, he starts to create things, and boom, uh, there's your beginnings of days. And so that's how they explain the age of the universe. Um, or there are some old Earth creationists that will say that each day actually was an age. They call themselves day age creationists. It's a day hyphen age creationists. And how that works is, or how they get to that thought is, I mean, in English, we have these words like ages or eons or centuries, millennia, that kind of thing. Well, in Hebrew, those aren't real, those aren't words, right? They have words for day, they have words for years or seasons, but they don't have words for like a really, really huge expanse of time or an age of time. And so they'll often say, in the days of X. Now, typically that occurs in the plural. So, for example, in the days of Elijah or in the days of King Ahab, this is a normal thing that happens in Hebrew. They don't mean like just a few days. They mean like during the time span, that time span. And so uh, an old Earth creationist will say, well, this was the first day. For example, in verse 4 and 5, when the narrator says day there, the narrator really means to say an age.
Yeah, I mean this to support that side as well with you, Lester. Just to not to seem one-sided, because honestly, I think you're representing the side you don't even believe in. So, congrats to you right now. But like in Second Peter, Peter says a day is like 1,000 years. So like
Mm-hmm.
that word shows up a bunch of the Bible. Now, I mean, that's a one-off I'm using right there to support, and I think be able to get around that. But it's a good point to bring up because there's the two ways to do it. Like obviously just the first 2 days took billions of years and the rest happened. Or, you know what, that day it's basically saying, well, he said day, but he actually means like eon or age or like long time. It's just like you can only write one word, right? So like that's kind of the thing. On the young Earth, I mean, it's so simple to explain. I'm just getting layups here. They just take yom as a day. That's what they take it as. There is some definitions in that like of Hebrew that will explain yom as if it's classified with like morning, evening, or night, or given a number, then it is for sure only talking about an actual day.
Mhm.
And in Genesis, we see a couple times it's classified with morning, evening, night, or number. And so that's a translation that young Earth theories would say, well, look, if the Hebrew rule is to classify it with those things and it means one day, well, then clearly it means one day because it's classified with those things. I mean, we're picking nets here. I'm like, obviously, someone could just be like, oh, no, but that time they didn't mean to. Um, I want to touch on something quickly with young Earth. Um, and I mean, old Earth has a case for it as well. And it goes along with Yom. Is this whole debate is really on the first like blip of Genesis, right? And
Mhm.
the rest of Genesis, most scholars, I would say, would read it historically. Would you agree to that?
Uh, most scholars would read which historically.
The rest of Genesis. So take out the part we're
Oh
arguing about
yes,
right
yeah, yeah,
now.
yeah,
The rest of Genesis, most
yeah,
biblical historicals are going to say that's a historical account. It's telling us
yeah,
what happened. It's telling us about
yeah.
these characters and how we got here.
Literal, yes.
Like it's a literal. It's not this mystical journey
Nope,
quest, J.R.
nope,
Tolkien type
nope.
story. No, it's literal. These people
Yeah,
existed. This is how they went about life. And so a younger theory is going to say, hey, um, if we're taking 90% of this book literal, why would it start with the first like two chapters or less being figurative? Like, why would you do that? If you wrote a book, why would you have a historical epic of what happened in like the start of America, but the first two chapters are just this like wild, like I don't want to say wild over like zealous fantasy, but just like a not historical view. Like when you write a historical book, you have it in historical ways, and when you write a fantasy or a poetry or something like that, you would write the whole book that way. And so that would be another argument that a younger theorist would use is like, hey, listen, if all of Genesis is written in historical dialect, then of course the first chapter and a half is also written in that same tone and setting, right?
yep, absolutely. And I just wanted to bolster your explanation on young Earth a little bit with the idea of yom. So typically, when they refer to an age with the yom, like plural, it would occur in the plural, like in the
Mm.
days of Elijah, in the days of King Ahab. It occurs in the plural when they try to do. When they try to use the word yom as a period of time. And so in Genesis, we actually see it in the singular. It's always, this was the first singular day. Also, you have to remember that in for example, verse 5 even, he separates the light and the darkness, and he calls the morning or the daytime, the light day, and the evening there's night. He separates that, and then he immediately says, and this is the first day. Like he literally used, like, why would he go, this was the day, and then, oh, this was actually, that was eons. um
Like this was the day, but that what I said before, scratch that.
oh
This is the day.
yeah, like, so um it would seem to be a very awkward reading. Um, and you have to remember that later in in chapter 1, he also uses the word seasons and years in the
Mhm.
plural. So he could have said, and these were the first years. He can do that, although that is not a typical Hebrew turn of phrase. They would still say, and these were, he could have said something like, and these were the first days. He can say that. Um, to indicate the
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
that
I
would
mean,
be the young earth argument. And essentially it's saying like there is more important, like it's more important to lean heavily on our special revelation as opposed to natural revelation. Now you were
That's where I
talking
was going.
about you
I
were
was going
talking
to ask you
about
that next. Sorry.
yeah, go ahead. Y-
There's our first big gaffe for being
yeah,
being. I was going to say we want to get in. We don't want to skip that
yeah.
special versus natural revelation. So why don't just run with it? I shouldn't have jumped in. Sorry.
The other thing that's you talked about how the book of Genesis essentially is a historical account after essentially what is chapter 2, um, and it's
Mhm.
important to remember there a point for the old Earth creationists would be that the first chapter actually is composed poetically, whereas the rest of the book actually is composed as narrative. The first chapter is poetic prose, so there is some metaphor that happens there, if that makes sense. So essentially, that first chapter in Genesis is a little bit different than, say, from chapters 3 and on, where the first chapter is essentially narrative prose. So there's a bit of poetry that goes on in Genesis 1 versus the rest of the book, where it's just essentially narrative, which is just literally a story. Um, and so in that, the old Earth creationists will say that, well, what the narrator or the author was doing there was taking some creative license with how the days are structured.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna do a lot of nitpicking to make each side work. Um, I, someone who's a young Earth theory could just argue, okay, yes, there are parts of that, but he's also describing the creation of our world.
Mhm.
So wouldn't I mean, wouldn't that be quite the sight to see? Wouldn't there be a little bit of poetry in that, and that we should take like more of the spectacle and not the like, oh, he's being very literal on what happened, but he's trying to like create this like spectacle of our world being created.
Yeah.
There's other defenses. I mean, I'm sure you could defend the own point you just made to yourself.
Yes.
So, but yeah, I wanted to. We were on the track of special versus natural revelation. That's where we were going.
Yes. Revelation.
Revelation.
Special.
Wow, I'm
No,
struggling today.
yeah, it's a tough word to say. Special versus natural revelation, and the whole idea there is that or the difference essentially between old and young is that a young earth creationist will say like we have to first look at special revelation and let that inform us about the natural world, um, whereas an old earth creationist will say well uh, we have to use both at the same time and say um, well natural revelation has told us this, how does that color my interpretation of the Bible? Whereas uh, Young Earth would be like, well, the Bible tells me this. How does that interpret, or how does that make me interpret the world? It's which lens do you look at a subject matter first? Uh, that's essentially the breakdown.
Yeah, I mean, we're asking where's our what we're asking right now is where are we making the mistake? Are we interpreting the Bible wrong? And that like do we is it a day is that where the interpretation is going wrong? Are we interpreting science and what we're learning about our world wrong? Or are we just
Exactly.
reading it wrong? Or is the Bible just wrong? And we're obviously having this as the Bible's right. So where is our mistake being made? Where are we interpreting it
Exactly.
wrong? And
Yeah.
so a younger theory would say, well, we're interpreting science wrong. Like there's evidence, and there is evidence to support young and old,
Yeah.
depending on what points you want to bring up. And then an old Earth would say, well, no, we need to use what we're learning about science to help our interpretation of the Bible. And
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not saying either one's. I'm not trying to say one's super wrong and one's super right. Um, there are many arguments, and I'll just say from a young Earth side that would say we should never use man's knowledge to interpret what God is telling us. And
Hmm.
so a lot of people who would ascribe to a young Earth would say, okay, but I'm going to use what God told me to interpret God's creation. I'm not going to use what science or secular knowledge or just what I think is true to interpret God's word. I know that's like really simplifying it, but a lot of people on the young earth theory would just say we should listen to God's word first, and then knowing that it's God's word, take that and see how do we fit science in the context into that. And not that it's like how do we make sure the science works? Like not that we're like we're trying to be like, oh, we ignore facts, but how do those facts align? How can we, show what God is saying to be true? And there is a lot of evidence that science does support a young earth. Like there's a lot of evidence there. So it's not like we're saying we ignore science on the young earth side. And it's not that the old earth is saying we ignore the Bible until science tells us what's true. It's just the perspective shift you're coming from. So it's just do we come at it what we've learned from science, now how do we interpret the Bible? Or what we learned from the Bible, now how do we interpret science?
Great explanation. Better than I could have done.
Thank you. um,
Yeah, and did you want to touch on some of the ways that young earth creationists square the age of the earth a little bit?
You know what? Let's go freestyle here because we've kind of set ourselves in like you've been the old earth guy and I've been the young earth guy. Let's just go. You can touch on any fact or any scientific theorem that would support either side and just explain why.
Okay. So old earth, some of the big arguments for old earth and old universe is, for example, the laws of thermodynamics and how everything is decaying. And we're looking at the decay of carbon in the earth and saying, well, look, it's a certain age because the carbon says that it's a certain age. For example, we know that stars are billions of light years away, yet we can still see their lights. So then it would have taken X amount of time for that light to travel in order for us to see it. So the universe must be X number of years old.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
can also look at the expansion of the universe and say like, well, the universe is expanding at this rate, and if it exploded or Big Bang from a singular point, then you can also kind of calculate roughly the age of the universe.
yeah. And to be honest, the rebuttal from a young earth might be, well, as much as we say we know how to measure light moving across the galaxy, there's actually a lot of debate on whether we're doing it right or how far we can actually measure out from our world. There gets a point where it's like, we're just kind of guessing. I watched a whole talk on it. I can't remember the distance, but if you disagree with me, go look it up. But there's actually a certain point after that we're kind of just doing some guesswork there. Not saying that scientists aren't doing great work, just that it's not like a factual evidence that everything is proof. I'm going to bring up one for young earth that's just kind of funny. And I never knew this until I researched for this podcast. So I never knew this, and it makes a lot of sense. But it's actually lunar recession. So how the moon is moving away slowly in orbit, moving away from the Earth. And I'm not saying like in 10 years the moon will be no longer visible. Like that's slow. But if you map that based on an old Earth theory, basically we would flood the Earth twice a day. For most of history, just because the the moon controls tides, and if that mapping is consistent with past, that means that most of humans would have spent all their time in water, or animals for most of human history, because the tides would have just buried most of the Earth.
Yeah, and you know what? My favorite science, or perhaps this is not scientific argument for young Earth, actually, is the idea of God creating Adam on the sixth day. Uh, what does God create there? Does God create an infant on the sixth day, or does God create a fully formed man on the sixth day? And I would say that God created a man. And so even though he was a single day old, he looks like a 30-year-old man, or what you and I would consider a 30-year-old man.
I mean,
And
at least in
so,
his depictions, he looks 30.
yeah, well, however he look, I mean, that he makes, and not an infant. And so, in the same way, God can create a very old-looking universe, and it would behoove him to do so. Because if he creates a very young universe, then things are very chaotic. Especially if he creates a very young Earth, things become very, very chaotic. And so it is entirely possible for God to create an old looking earth that's not outside the realm of possibility.
Hmm, I like that. Do you have any other little points? I mean, they can
Nope.
just be the normal points. I mean, they don't have to be. Um, Here's another cool one I found, and I'm just kind of going off weird ones. There are way better ones to solidify a certain side of the argument. So if you're like, why are they using weird ones? It's because I want to have fun. So yeah. um, just a weird one is subterranean pressure. So like how oil and stuff sits below the surface.
Mhm.
An idea of a young Earth. If oil had been sitting under rocks for as long as if billions of years, the amount of pressure that it sits under, it would have caused like a release. Like the pressure has to go somewhere eventually, right?
Mhm.
And so there's an argument to say, and I never even do this. This is crazy. Um, but because how much like pressure the oil is under, because of rocks sitting on it, and other fluids like natural gas and water and stuff like that, um, that pressure would have built over time and causing an escape. Like it would, like these huge geysers would have blown of like oil, water, natural gas, and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But for some reason, these huge deposits are still under this pressure, meaning that if you just do a quick like time, if that pressure can only be there for so long. Therefore, it's only been there for so long. Therefore, the Earth is down. Now, this is like that's like a weird example that I like just learned, so I don't even have a grasp
Mhm.
of it really. But I just
Yeah.
thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. I do remember one more, and then we can close after this. The idea of measuring the amount of sediment on the ocean floor, and how it's only a mile deep, approximately. Now, if the Earth was billions of years old, that sediment should be like hundreds of miles deep, as opposed to
Mhm.
only being a mile deep. Now, an old Earth creationist would say, well, that sediment is being recycled because it falls into the tectonic plate, between the shifting of the tectonic plates, and that there's a cycle there. But some young Earth creationists like to say that, well, then it still should be like, you know, 50, 60, 70 miles deep, as opposed to just a single mile deep.
Mhm. Here's another one, and I know you can rebuke this right away, but we have to bring it up because every kid from the ages of 7 to 17 gets taught about this in school, and there's questions. How could natural variations like the Grand Canyon exist? So, a scientific explanation would be erosion over a long period of time. The river eventually eats away and builds this huge canyon. Now, some people say, well, that's a pretty small river for that big of a canyon. um, and other people just explain, oh, like over time, the river, goes different ways, loses, whatever. What would be a young Earth theory to explain a natural phenomenon like that? Because scientists normally explain, like, look, you can see the years of erosion over time, and through carbon dating, we can tell that this stuff has been here. How would you explain the young Earth? I know the answer, but I want you to give a young Earth one.
Yeah, I mean, the answer, first of all, is not difficult. God can create the Grand Canyon. You think he lacks the creativity to create something? Like, he knows what is beautiful, and he is perfectly capable of doing something like that. And he does stuff like that to highlight how glorious he is, how amazing his creation is, and how much he should be worshipped. Those are things that remind us of who God is. Um, and so, uh, to I think to say like, look, Grand Canyon, old
Old
Earth,
Earth.
is like probably a little bit short sighted. Um, but yes, it is possible to think about it that way.
I mean, these are we're chipping arguments that everyone is going to like. I mean, that's a common argument.
Yeah,
The Grand
it is.
Canyon, mountains, stuff like that. Like, how do you explain that? Because on the other side, how are mountains like Everest still as tall as they are if erosion and stuff takes overhold? Wouldn't over billions of years they just be flattened out?
Yes and no. From the old Earth creationists, yes, they get flattened out by the wind and the moving things moving across, but like also the tectonic plates are pushing them
Pushing
up.
back up.
Yeah, so there's this ever constant battle of pushing up and eroding top.
Okay, there's an example. There's also another explanation that some Christian scientists use for the Grand Canyon, which is the flood. So take a
Yes.
look at that. I'm not going to explain that, but um, if that amount of water actually sat on the surface of the Earth, there'd be some big big things would happen.
Geological impacts,
Yeah, there'd be
absolutely.
huge geological impacts. But look it up. I mean, we don't have time to go into every single
Yeah.
little argument that people are explaining because we're both already agreeing that God created the Earth. So it's not like a evolution versus creation talk.
And that is like the final. There is one sect of young Earth creationists that will say, like, when Adam and Eve sinned and introduced evil into the world, that actually had physical changes for the Earth. You can ascribe to this theory or not, but some young Earth creationists will say, like, because evil entered the world changed in a very real and drastic way.
Yeah, so that brings up another point before we get to so what, because we're going to get to so what. Like, what does this mean? Pretty soon. Do you want to touch on the idea of sin and death and the conflict that has with old Earth?
That is a long topic.
Yeah,
and
that's why I'm
be...
asking. Do you want to touch on it? Or do you want to leave it and we can talk about it?
I think we ought to leave it for
Okay,
another episode.
awesome, love that. All right, so what haven't we touched on this? Evolution. We haven't really talked about that.
Yeah. So whether you're an old Earth creationist or a young Earth creationist, it's important to remember that while we do believe in microevolution, there are small variations in species. I mean, the fact that a pug and a poodle are the same species of thing is proof that microevolution can happen. But we don't believe that, for example, whether you're an old Earth creationist or a young Earth creationist, that God used the mechanism of evolution so that he created Adam from like an amoeba. That's not a thing.
Yeah, if you're a creationist, the creationist kind of just deters that whole idea of like we were made through evolution. Old Earth or young Earth creationists, you still believe God created Adam. There wasn't this like from the one cell organism all the way up to Adam.
There was a historical Adam, like there was an actual Adam.
Yes,
singular guy. That's a real thing.
And that's why I said, do you want to touch on the whole idea of sin and death?
Romans 5.
Huge topic. Well, we were not going to touch on it, but there's a lot there. And hey, people who listen to this can go find information to prove us wrong or prove us right.
We'll have an episode on sin where I'll get a lot more into that.
Yeah. So why don't we move forward with so what?
Honestly, so what? So what?
Yeah. I was going to say that.
Really, really, when you get down to it, so what? Like, so-and-so believes old Earth creation, like we outlined. Okay. You believe young Earth creation. Okay. But what's important there is that you've thought about it, you've considered it, that you have an answer for it, and that your answer is biblical, that you can support it with the Bible. And so as long as you can do that, what's more important here is your thinking process and the way that you came to that understanding as opposed to the final decision that you make. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add, we've said this so many times, but it really doesn't matter on something like this. And you shouldn't be losing your faith because someone said, "Oh, I believe in an old Earth." Now, this issue may rise to you. I'm not saying the issue doesn't matter, but I'm saying I wouldn't put my whole faith like, "Oh, if they're a young Earth theory, they're not a true Christian," and like and stuff like that. I think there's really smart people. There's a lot smarter people than me on both sides of this issue who've done a lot of research, who've written books, who've been in big debates. So I would learn more from them if this is something you're like really interested in. Because I know there's things in the Bible that they're like tertiary issues, but I enjoy studying them. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. I want to know more about that. So if that's you, I mean, go find smarter people than us to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I would finish with Lester. After the debate, what side would you side on?
I'm actually a young Earth creationist. So I do
Oh
believe
my
that
goodness.
the
I'm just kidding,
the age of
obviously.
the Earth is somewhere between 20 and 6,000 years, and how you get to that number is you count genealogies in the Bible. And yes, I'm aware that they skip genealogy. They skip the genealogy, skip generations. If you take it as like there are only these generations, then it's approximately 6,000. Whereas if you allow for many, many skips, you're in the 20,000 range. But still, it's thousands, not millions, and that's where I fall.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, and I think we emphasized this earlier, and Brett emphasized this, but it's really important to not divide over this issue amongst Christians. Just let it go.
Yeah, I mean, I also openly say I don't really have a side in this.
Yeah,
I tend towards maybe a young Earth because, like, to be honest, before this podcast, I'd done about a minute and a half of research in my life about this issue.
yeah,
So, like, to me, I'm like, I wouldn't die in either camp. I would
yeah,
just, like, I would say, like, there's things that I like about both. I would personally, I'm moving towards young Earth, but to be honest, like, I know really smart people who are old Earth, and I wouldn't debate anyone on this
yeah,
subject for like any stakes. Like, it's just, to me, it's never been an issue, and it doesn't affect my faith at all. But it's fun to learn about. I'll say
yeah.
that.
Yeah, and finally, to kind of assuage some of your fears of not knowing, I mean, or not coming down on the side, there are many really smart theologians, guys who write commentaries and a lot of biblical writing, who actually say, like R.C. Sproul says, I don't know. When asked this question, he actually says, I don't know. He says that, there are great points on both sides and he hasn't made his mind up. And that is okay.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think this isn't even about this topic anymore, but um, the reason I say I don't have a side is because I'd rather just say I don't know than try to defend something I
yeah.
don't care or want to put any time into. I'm not saying that I haven't put time into it, but I'm just saying, like, I don't know because there's smarter people than me out there having this this contextual battle. And to be honest, I don't care about it enough to really like put anything behind it. So if you're like me and you're like, yeah, honestly, I don't know and I don't care, like, that's fine. Just say I don't know. But like, if someone asks you about it, then I would I would encourage you not to get like aggressively on one side of the argument and be like, well, what about this? Unless you're playing devil's advocate, just to like, I mean, like sometimes in my own small group, one of us will play devil's advocate just to test each other's beliefs, right? Like, just be like, oh, did I really think this through? But yeah, I'm on that side of I don't know, and that's fine. I don't need to know the answer to this. This isn't going to affect my life in a huge way. I like that podcast. I thought it was going to get a little bit more fighting. And see if you can guess where the lag is in the middle of the podcast and where we had to restart. And if you could email the testing123 podcast at Springvale, it's testing123 at springvale.org, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
If you could email and find the guess, we'll feature your story on the podcast.
We will.
Because there was a huge lag in this podcast and we had to restart. So if you can find that moment, that would be really funny. But yeah, as always, guys, if you have questions, reach out to the Testing123 podcast, which is testing123 at springvale.org. And Lester and me will love to answer your questions. And if we think it's good enough to talk about on air, we'll definitely do that, because if you have a question, someone else listening probably has the same question. But other than that, we will see you guys next week. Lester, anything to add?
Cool.
Awesome, guys. See you next week.
See ya.